welcome to SIIMCast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine.
Hello, listeners. This is Arjun. I've been given the honor of recording the introduction for this episode, as this is going to be my final episode as an official host and showrunner of the podcast. The podcast has come a long way in the last few years. We started at RSNA 2016 or something like that, with me just using the internal microphone on a laptop and shoving it in front of Paul Naji's face. Now we have a much more elaborate setup, and I'm happy that I can say I'll be leaving it in comfortable, good hands. I've really enjoyed recording this podcast over the years and working with Prasanth and Jay, Alok, and now Mohanad. The only reason I'm really leaving is because I feel like at this point we've covered almost all the topics that I can think of and can bring to the table. This season in particular, I was really excited that we did auto hotkey, VR, sustainability, radiopedia, so just a lot of the topics and areas of expertise that I thought I could bring to the table have been covered. So it seemed like a nice time to leave. At the same time, we've been bringing on people over the years, and I'm excited to see what new topics and content they'll bring to the SIIMCast. This is also the end of the season episode, which we've done for a few years now. We're going to have all the hosts in this episode, including Dr. Alok Anand, who is in the Middle East right now. And so we kind of talked to him a little bit about what he's been doing out there. We talk a bit about the podcast and its history. We talk a bit about the SIIM meeting, which was now last week, but this episode was recorded before the meeting. And then we talk a bit about where the podcast is going to go in season 5. So I just wanted to say thank you to all the listeners who've been with us for these last few years. I'm excited to be joining you guys as listeners, although I'll probably join as, a guest or co-host every now and then as well. It's been real. This is Arjun signing off. Bye, everyone, and thank you.
So, Alok, I was wondering, having been overseas for over about a year now, what kind of informatics stuff have you been working on? And you talked about meeting more and more people in the field over there. Have you been meeting more people?
Yeah. So, it's been interesting because it was quite a transition for me, starting in a small community hospital with admittedly strained resources to going to a large academic center with a great deal more funding, resources, partnerships already in place with various government entities. So my sort of strategy was kind of twofold. One was learning the layout of the land, getting to meet the chief medical informatics officer, and then also starting to branch out and understand some more of the relationships with other institutions in the hopes of working on things like imaging and informatic exchanges. I have to say a lot of it also is getting used to my new role. I was doing a fair amount of IR and diagnostic radiology before, and now I'm doing a much smaller amount, just doing minor procedures. And then the vast majority of my time is spent doing diagnostic radiology. So in addition to transitioning those clinical responsibilities and kind of, learning to flex different muscles, I've been, working on the informatics front, but it's been a lot of fun. Right now, I'm still in the relationship building phase, and we're slowly starting to see some changes. I've taken on some small projects, reworking our dictation templates and streamlining some of our workflows, looking at processes, and then getting our department to use some more of our business informatics and analytics tools to get better data. It's been a lot of fun, really enjoying it.
Awesome. How is the transition on the social and family aspect? I know it's a big change from being in the States. How the kids handled it?
So, the kids have had their moments. It's been a challenge. We were lucky enough to get them into American Community School here with, essentially your standard curriculum. And so really there haven't been any major language issues, but of course, adjusting to a new culture, new settings has been, had its fair share of challenges. Interestingly, because I don't know if people realize this, but this part of the Middle East, the 60% of the population is actually South Asian. So on a given day, I speak English first, second would be Hindi and Urdu, and then third, and a very distant third, is Arabic. It's interesting, yeah. So in that sense, we sort of have a little bit of a leg up in terms of the transition, but it's been really interesting and a real growth experience for the kids.
So broadly speaking, how's their healthcare system different than, what we have in the States?
Well, it's interesting. So it's sort of divided into tiers. So Emirati residents have their own brand of healthcare called Thika, which is basically full coverage for pretty much any services. And in addition to that, not only are you covered for any care within the country, but if you travel outside the country, any surgeries, like routine ER, major procedures are all covered in full, primarily using like a reimbursement-based system, but it's 100%. And then for the various people who come to work in the country, you're required to have some form of private insurance. And that is also divided into tiers. It was a little bit of a surprise to me to see how much the private payer system is very similar to the way things are set up in the States. I think certain aspects in terms of getting pre-authorization vary a little bit, but it is basically a fee-for-service model. We don't really see the type of ACOs forming where it's outcomes-based or population-based. That model hasn't really taken off yet. I hope it does, but it seems like in many ways we are converging with the system that we have in the States. So it's interesting to see the transition.
So I know we've talked, like last year we had a couple episodes on COVID, and we're going through having the vaccines here in the States and Canada, but how have you guys changed and adjusted with things? I know Jason had a lot of changes to his team, particularly last fall. And he can talk a little bit about that after you answer this. But what did you guys have to go through there?
I think most of the pain points and the changes were already implemented by the time that I arrived. So we got here in the middle of August and then started basically just before the beginning of September. And so in terms of triaging emergent versus non-emergent cases, safety protocols, changing how our schedules were allocated, the times allotted for procedures and office visits, all of that had already been done. Even the safety hygiene protocols that were being implemented were already there. So in many ways, I just sort of inherited what was already being done. And they had made huge progress. There was a pretty severe lockdown that I think occurred somewhere, between April and July, essentially, that brought cases down to a very, manageable level. And things were already starting to slowly open up. So I didn't really get the benefit of seeing how those processes were implemented, but I certainly got to get closer to what was more like a normal type of schedule and process flow by the time I got here.
How has the vaccine rollout been going there? I was listening to a very interesting podcast. Forget the name of it. Maybe we can put it in the show notes, but it was about how in 1998, Canada was developing the blueprint for electronic health records. The system got abandoned, but where they were going to start was vaccine registries. Israel did it, and that's why Israel was so successful at their vaccine rollout, is because they went to Pfizer and Moderna and said, we can show you all these health analytics on how 35-year-olds respond versus 65-year-olds. So yeah, how's the vaccine rollout going where you are, Arlo?
It's been amazing, actually. So the country, because of the way things are set up, they have the ability to basically implement things on a national scale, essentially in a very, very short period of time, almost overnight. So they actually have implemented, I'll show you guys, there's this app that everyone has. You have a constantly updating QR code that gives you basically up-to-date information about your vaccine status, when you got your jabs, and then also every single PCR test that you've had. And everything is centralized. So whether I get a swab done at work, which we have to do every 2 weeks as care providers, that immediately gets fed into this central system. I see that I have updated results and your status changes. So for example, you can freely go across the borders within the Emirates if you have like this, basically an E designation, which means you have a recent PCR and you're fully vaccinated. I mean, it's really impressive to see how tightly integrated it is. It's very impressive. The vaccine rollout was exceptionally well organized. I mean, relatively speaking, everything was like SMS alerts for when you made your appointments, when you were confirmed. As soon as you got out of your first jab, I had a text alert telling me when to report, where to report for my second one to the hour, which was really cool. And even when they made changes, so for example, they shut down one of the sites and opened to a larger site, all of that was automatically updated and pushed out. So I'm sure people encountered some confusion and some issues, but for me, the experience was way better than I expected it to be.
How much mask resistance and vaccine hesitancy have you faced out there?
Interestingly, the resistance that I'm seeing now is actually more from other caregivers, from other people working in the hospital. Short of forcing people to get the vaccines, they basically made it monetarily and logistically very, very costly not to be vaccinated. So if you don't have a vaccine and you want to work in certain public spaces, you have to get weekly COVID swabs. Your travel is severely restricted. If you don't have the vaccine, you actually have to pay for your own swabs. So they have essentially made it the only reasonable option is to get the vaccine. But I think that's translated into a very positive response. The last I heard, for every 100 people, they have administered 111 jabs. So we're at the point where basically everyone has had at least one, the eligible adult populations. So it's been cool.
Do you think that part of the reason you guys have had some of these things, we talk about the app and everything, because it's a smaller country, it's easier to roll these things out so quick? Like you're saying, some of these things are almost overnight. One, geographically, it's a smaller country. Two, it's a smaller population.
Oh, for sure. I think there's two main aspects to it. One is the size. And, it's interesting. So, for example, when I lived in Japan, I looked at the 3G and the 4G rollout when I was living there. And it was amazing the pace at which they were able to do those deployments. And I think there's a parallel here. Our population is, I believe, somewhere between 6 and 9 million. And so we're able to do things on a national scale with admittedly far fewer resources and time and distances required. And then I think the second aspect is that, for lack of a better word, it is somewhat of an authoritarian regime where policies are dictated. They're not by consensus building or public forum discussions. It's more or less policies are handed down. And so I think in cases like this, you see where that translates into much faster progress. Certainly there's trade-offs, but I think that has a lot to do with it. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the size of the country has a lot to do with that as well.
On Friday, I was attending a webinar and they were talking about Canada, who is a very similar geographic stance than the US, but we are about a tenth the population of you. The analogy was we're like a rice grain rolling around in a maraca. And it can be challenging trying to set up infrastructure across such a geographically sparse area. But I guess as we're reflecting upon the year, I think we'd be remiss not to maybe bring attention to the new member on the team. So we have a new person that's joined. How have you been enjoying it so far, Mohammed?
I'm loving it. As you guys know, I've already been a fan of the SIIMCast. So I joined from a position of admiration of the work that all four of you gentlemen have been putting in. And yeah, so far so good. It's great. I'm excited about the couple of episodes, well, more than a couple now, a few that I was involved in recording, and excited for the next season. So thank you all for having me.
No, it's been great getting another perspective. And you recently changed jobs too, right?
Yes, sir. I've left full-time employment and went full-time out on my own.
So you're doing consulting work, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a tough transition for sure.
I was very lucky. I had a bit of a runway, which really allowed me to kind of like hinge leaving my full-time employment into a nice big contract, which kind of gave me a nice runway. So I can't sit here and pretend that I've taken risks as much as your typical entrepreneur who decides to quit cold turkey and, go find work. I was very lucky that I had a number of safety nets in place that made this transition a lot easier for me.
It sounds like you're doing a really cool project. Do you want to talk about it at all?
I don't necessarily have a ton of solid results to share today, but I can kind of give you an idea. So one of my projects that I'm involved in right now is a research project with a local hospital here called Trillium Health Partners. It's actually a group of 3 hospitals that amalgamated recently being in the last decade or so. So the project is to establish a repository of research images. Initially, we're starting with X-rays. So we're actually taking all the X-rays that were done between 2016 through 2020, all the checks X-rays. So that's about 500K or so. And we're going to de-identify them, keep them, and then use those to evaluate different AI models and algorithms that look at chest X-rays and provide results. And this is going to be everything from commercial solutions to open source solutions as well. We're also going to be studying the potential for integrating AI into the workflow. What is the best way to present the results to the radiologist? Do we want to use the results to prioritize the work list, or do we want to show the results immediately to the radiologist when they open up the study? Or do we show them the results after they've formed an opinion? Like, how do you minimize automation bias and things like that? What's the smoothest way of integrating something like that into the workflow so it's assisting the radiologist rather than being a hindrance, one extra thing they click? And we all know the domain well enough to know how much everybody hates that extra click.
And maybe it's worth mentioning, I guess, that you're working with a former guest that was on the SIIMCast episode 34, Dr. Ben Fine, I believe. If you're interested, check out episode 34. It was an interesting episode about terminology management with a machine learning model. Prasanth, anything that you want to share? How have things been keeping with on your end the past year?
Just busy. All of us have been busy and getting pulled in a lot of directions that we weren't before. Like I was alluding to before, I know Jason had a lot of different changes with his team and things. There are a lot of changes that we had to roll with. And I think that kind of spilled out into the SIIMCast in the sense that, if we look at season 3, we had almost 24, 26 episodes. And then this season has been, I think, closer to one a month almost. And I think that's kind of part of it is we all got busier with a lot of other things. We didn't have many people with home workstations. And then suddenly we have to get 40, 50 home workstations. So luckily I looked ahead in the future down the road. I'm like, we're going to have supply chain problems. We better start ordering now. Back in March, and we were able to get in a lot of orders before a lot of the logistics dried up. And by the end of the summer, I think we were able to get everybody a home workstation. And then, of course, they want analytics on it. Like, are they actually being as productive? This, that. And just because everybody's trying to now, even as we're going into relative pre-COVID norms or transitioning back, some people are like, why can't I just continue to work from home instead? And justifying the cost of the workstations and allowing people to work from home more. I've heard of different stories on the radio about some people are more productive at home and this and that. But since medicine tends to be conservative, we probably are more of the factory model where people come to work, they punch their clock, the management can see them, that kind of thing, instead of, yeah, sure, as long as you're getting your work done, you can work from home. So that's a bit of a transition there. And then more and more other projects that keep on getting thrown on the fire here and there. So, but it's good. It's good. Arjun, have anything changed with your job, or is it still nights and days and days and nights?
Well, it's funny. It's 9 a.m. my time, 9:30, and I've been awake for 18 hours or something like that because I just worked overnight. But hey, it's okay. I get the next 2 weeks off. It's also funny, like 4 of the 5 of us, I don't know about you, Jason, but have changed jobs in the last year. Although I kind of vaguely remember you changed jobs in the last couple of years too. My job change was almost exactly a year ago. I left because I wanted to work remotely. And then COVID happened while I was exiting my other job. And so I went to a job working for a New York firm from my basement for 9 months. Then I went back to the job I was at originally because the COVID had happened and they couldn't find anybody to replace me. And some other things fell back in place. So I'm happy. I'm back at the original job that I had been at for 5 or 6 years. I'm working from my basement and all the things are happy there. And I love working from home, by the way. My setup is awesome and it's just great. The IBM work actually was almost done. I was just packing up my laptop, work laptop, and my eye gaze tracking hardware. And then they are pulling me back in, it seems like. So I might continue working over there a bit. And then there's other opportunities here and there. But going back to what Prasanth was saying, I don't know if we went necessarily from 2 a month to 1 a month. It's probably somewhere between 2 and 1 now, a little bit less than last year. But I also really enjoyed a lot of the episodes we did this year. I don't know that I would say the quality's higher. Maybe it is, but guests were very varied and interesting. And even things that I didn't have necessarily, like the digital pathology one is a good example from like a month or two ago that I was totally surprised with, but I really enjoyed. Jason brought that one. The Radiopedia one, I mean, it's really cool that now we have access to some of these people that maybe we did in years prior, but we just have confidence now to reach out and say, hey, we've been doing this thing for 50 episodes, so we have some legitimacy. So yeah, I don't know. I really enjoyed this season quite a bit. So as I do exit or decrease my involvement in the podcast, I certainly hope that you'll allow me to sneak my way into a few episodes, depending on what the topics are and so forth.
You'll be like Leonardo DiCaprio coming in to Growing Pains later on and making a cameo appearance here on SIIMCast. So we'd appreciate that. My job has not changed. I work for the same organization, but there's been a lot of changes over the past 12 months or so. Yeah, a lot of work from home. The team has not really come into the office at all. And it's interesting. I wrote down a couple of the episodes that caught my attention. One was the Beyond the Scope episode that we had. I think we walked into that with very low expectations of what we were going to talk about. Maybe it was going to be a discussion about podcasts, and it really went in a great discussion about enterprise imaging, and that was good. I really liked the Rick Wiggins conversation. I liked the Herman conversation, which has not been posted yet. Yeah, it was a good year. I'm happy to be part of this and keep going. It's exciting.
My favorite moment was when, I can't remember which podcast, I think it was the CMIO edition, when one of the guests told us that, hey, thank you for having me on the podcast. I just earned some street cred with my kids, teenager kids. So that's priceless. Always nice to hear.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. I thought the VR discussion was pretty interesting. As much as we're all techies, that's one area that I really haven't kept up with. And then learning about like, oh yeah, VR packs, and then kind of going down the rabbit hole a little bit, just thinking ahead for my own institution instead of plopping down $3,000 for a workstation at home. It's like, here's your $300 VR pack set up, go wherever. I was just like, wow, that could save a ton of money for us and, and whatnot.
Did any of you guys take the vendor up on the trial run for the VR?
I'm just going to ask if Arjun did, because I know he's been very interested in this.
Yeah, I did. It was very cool. I think it was November of last year or something like that. So I have to remember there was something that they were doing that was kind of surprising to me at the time. It seemed like it was less for straight diagnostic use than it was for case sharing. So they were really working on the ability to show somebody else what you're doing while you're looking at images. And I don't remember exactly what the reason for that being like the main use case was at the time, but maybe it's because they don't want to do the FDA, this is for diagnostic use thing. So instead, this is another angle or approach. But don't hold me to that. I can't remember if that's exactly what was going on. I did want to mention another episode. The auto hockey one is really cool. The reason I want to highlight that one, it's not because I enjoyed it so much, but also because one thing that I'm looking forward to, and this is a total pro segue, at the meeting next week is the learning lab for auto hockey use. There's so many offerings at SIIM every year at the annual meeting that I haven't had a chance to do many of the learning labs. I did in Portland. I remember their virtual reality device one. I remember, some really cool applications, although I don't think anything that I saw back then is being used today. But, it's always proof of concept stuff anyway. Auto hockey is not proof of concept. People should show up and learn how to use it and implement it. But I'm really excited for that next week. And I was kind of curious if there's anything else you guys have been looking forward to, if you've had a chance to peruse the agenda yet.
For what it's worth, I did listen to the episode on AutoHotkey and noticed the learning lab, and it's very exciting. When I heard the episode, I was actually very excited to try it. The only problem is just around the time, because that was when I left my job and went on my own, is when I exited the Windows world. And now I'm an official full-time Linux user. So no AutoHotkey on Linux, but nonetheless, you can actually do similar things on Linux. It's actually baked into the operating system. But yeah, really cool. I look forward to the outcome from the learning lab, because I could see this as being something would be very useful for a lot of people, but not a lot of people have been exposed to it yet. So it's a well-hidden secret.
There's several people in my department that used AutoHotkey, and I had no idea that it was in active use. So yeah, Alok, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you use AutoKey on the Linux side, a lot of the contracts and the syntax are actually similar. So they ports over, but it's very powerful.
To speak to Arjun's other question about looking at the schedule for next week, one thing I noticed is that almost every day there's a SIIM Global session in the morning with imaging informatics in different parts of the world. And one of them is imaging informatics in the Middle East. So I didn't know, Alok, are you speaking as part of that or taking part in any way?
I'm actually not part of the panel, but I'll definitely be listening in. maybe it'll lead to some other connections or potential collaborations. Very excited about that.
Prasanth is all about volunteering people for sessions. He used to run a private practice radiology session. I don't know if that was at RSNA or SIIM. And then he tried to push me into it after he went into academics.
Well, I figured that someone's got to fill the spot that I was going to be if they were going to keep doing that. So I thought, hey, who better?
Yeah. Although I actually ended up going into academics for those 9 months last year too. I have one more for next week. I want to put, I guess, a hashtag ad for the trivia night. I think it's Wednesday night. If it's when we originally planned it. The guy that's running the trivia night used to run them in Chicago all the time. And he's just super knowledgeable. He interacts with Ken Jennings. He's in a league with Ken Jennings. Like, that's how good this guy is at trivia. And he can just like riff on anything and come up with cool topics and cool trivia questions. It's going to be a really good time. There's going to be one round, I think, that's sim related, and the rest of it will be general bar trivia. But bring your glass of wine and come. It'll be a pretty good time, I think. And we're going to do teams too. You can bring a team, I think. It'll get randomized or something like that. But yeah, it'll be fun.
Should we have Team SIIMCast?
I would do that with you guys if you want.
Yeah, now you're talking.
That could be fun. One session I was looking at, which I think will be interesting because I've had to help mitigate this in my own institution, is there's one on Thursday, de-escalation and customer service. This is something that we don't really talk a lot about, at least in years past. So I think I brought it up when the program committee was trying to figure out what we're going to do for this year. You hear horror stories, especially from people that are on the phone customer service, or especially with cell phones now, someone will be walking and they're yelling at some representative of a bank or this or that. It becomes a thing where it's like, well, yeah, people may be angry for whatever reason. How do you de-escalate that? How do you provide the customer service when somebody's angry and they're on the phone with you? And I'm sure a lot of PACS administrators, they get an earful, and not even just PACS administrators, but people that are in admin positions. I occasionally get these emails. Why is this wrong? Or what's going on with this? And da-da-da-da. And your first reaction may be one thing, but then you have to like take a step back and say, yeah, okay, I see where you're coming from. So I think that's going to be an interesting one to go to. And it can be applied in just about every position throughout the imaging informatics chain.
I really enjoyed the cardiology informatics session. And now there's a repeat session on that, which should be interesting. But at the same time, there's also a pathology informatics session, which as I go through this, I'll be definitely having a focus on the EI side of things as I carve out where my sessions are that I'm going to be watching. But pathology informatics looks good. And Neil Parwani is giving that session.
Looking at the Dwyer lecture, looks like Flanders is giving it, and it's something about serendipity and unintended consequences. So that's also an area that I'm curious about. If you notice throughout many of the podcasts, there's usually a question about some sort of unintended consequences, and that's probably from me. That'll be an interesting one.
Did you guys check out the networking email application that was sent out like a week or two ago?
I've got it on my to-do list. I was hoping to have done that by today, but not quite yet. One of the things that's intriguing for me about the annual meeting this year is this AI platform that they've got going. I haven't tried it yet, but it's interesting.
I only opened it up to see what it was. It looks really interesting. It looks like it's going to take some activation energy work on the front end, but yeah, I think it'll be pretty cool. So yeah, definitely check it out. Jason, it sounded like you might have tried it.
No, I haven't tried it yet. Same boat as Mohanad.
You need to be on top of this because remember, Prasanth appointed you as the AI standards guy.
Oh, yes.
So everything AI, you got to be right on top of it, my friend.
I was knighted.
There I go, volunteering people again. I actually did open it up and started setting things up. You're right, Arjun. There's going to be some amount of activation energy on it because they want you to fill out the different areas that you're interested in. But one of the things, I kind of skipped a few of those. I was going to do them later. But one of the things I thought was it's like MySpace where everyone's friends with Tom. Because as soon as I got in there, there were like already two people that were interested. And I'm like, I have nothing in here other than being a SIIM member.
But you're a celebrity. People may have heard you on the podcast, right?
That's true. I think we get upward 150 plus a month downloads now.
I don't know per month. Per episode, we're getting, I think we're getting like 220, 250, something like that.
That's heading up to almost 15-20% of the SIIM membership.
I think so. I can never remember exactly what the numbers are of the membership. I mean, but wait, let's see. If we take 50 episodes times 200, are we close to 100,000 downloads? 10,000 then, right?
10,000. Yep.
All right. A lot of people have listened to our voices. And then if each of those episodes are an hour long, that's 10,000 hours listened.
Huh.
Yeah, according to Libsyn, we have almost 15,000 unique downloads.
Wow.
That's crazy.
As far as this year goes, it looks like the IHE AI workflow and results with Kinson, Chris Lindop, and Kevin was the most downloaded. 283.
Wow. That was a good episode.
No, the one that was the most was remote reading workflow. That was our special edition live podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So that was over 300 downloads plus however many people watched it live.
Well, then you guys have your work cut out for you next year. And I realize you guys haven't had these conversations yet, but do we have any idea what season 5 will hold in store?
I think we've got a couple of things that are going to be lined up sometime soon. I've got to shoot an email back off to Arjun and Bill. They've started a new business. So with the first season, how we had several people talking about entrepreneurship at different phases. Now, after they've completed the cycle and are starting again, I thought it'd be interesting to come and talk to them about their new venture and the lessons learned, how they're applying those things that they talked about in our first episode, and what are the new struggles. Then I've spoken with the SIIM staff about trying to get them on. We've talked about this in the past, like Nikki, Andrea, Priyanka, Brendan, Anna, so on. The list goes on. And I don't want to forget anybody, but my brain's been a sieve these last few years. So trying to get them on and kind of peek behind the curtain, if you will. They do so much work in preparation for the annual meeting and during the annual meeting, and they just run everything behind the scenes. And I've always thought it'd be great to kind of get them in the spotlight a little bit and just give everybody a chance to get a better appreciation for what they do. Mahana, do you have any thoughts on episodes you'd like to see?
Yeah, so one episode that we recorded this season is putting a spotlight on the vendor community. And this episode that we recorded focused on R&D specifically, kind of like the processes of what it takes to create a patch or a new version of a product and things like that. It hasn't come out yet, but I have a feeling it's going to be an interesting episode for a lot of people. And it would be nice if we could maybe do a follow-up next season where we talk about the service side of vendors, of how does it work? What are the different tiers? What are the different personas? People specialize in doing different things, front-end integrations versus back-end integrations and things like that. So that'll be intriguing.
Yeah, the vendor developer voice is definitely something that we'd been missing for a while. So it was really nice to have you on to help bring that to the podcast, Mohammed.
It's interesting. The service one will be an interesting perspective just because I know a lot of people that admire products that vendors create, but there's a very big gap between the respect that the product gets and the respect that the service gets. And it's an interesting paradigm in the sense that there's obviously a very big cultural gap between the R&D team and the service teams. And who is the one that can be the biggest impression for the customer is the service team, obviously. So that'll be an interesting article. Depending on the vendors that we have, I'll have to be careful how I respond. I'm looking forward to next season, season 5. I can't believe we're already at season 5. We're going into kindergarten. I would be looking forward to just going a little further into enterprise imaging. There was a really cool study that was just published from a local hospital here in Toronto at Sunnybrook. They did some interesting AI research against some pathology. We have a pretty good relationship with Sunnybrook, so I'm reaching out to them and seeing if they'd be interested to be part of the podcast as well. We'll see where that goes.
One thing I think would be kind of neat, one of the issues with Alok being completely on the other side of the planet is he hasn't been able to do as much. But one of the things I was thinking of was he could record some podcasts on his own, essentially. I mean, if you look back at season 1, Arjun and I were not always on the same podcast together. We would record independently. And then as things started cycling into season 2, we started recording more on the same time. And Jason came in and we're having multiple hosts. So that got me thinking like, well, why couldn't Alok get some people in his part of the world to talk about different things? And that would add to the mix. And bring up lots of other interesting questions about how things are done elsewhere in the world, particularly as SIIM is doing more of a global initiative. We can learn from each other. Might as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of facets to informatics, right? As we've seen, there's the service side, the developer vendors. Obviously, almost half of us are physicians. There are so many perspectives and areas where informatics is important. I think it's great. And one of the things that I love is when we have guests who come back and offer either slightly different perspectives or even just further elaborate on some of the ideas and concepts. I think it's a win-win. And I think we all have to sort of paint with multiple brushes. And I think it sort of speaks to that, bringing in different ideas, different people, and different geographic regions.
Yeah, no, that'd be cool. We're always looking for new people and or new ideas. So the listeners, if you have any ideas for episodes, we're all open ears. I know SIIM has made a couple call for volunteers. So if you're interested in joining, please join or get in touch with us.
No recording studio required.
Yep. For me, it's going to be kind of weird because I started this with Arjun and then we were working together with IBM, and then we've been co-chair for content and engagement committee and, whatever it was before that. So he and I have done a lot together over the last 5 years. So for me, it's kind of a little weird with him stepping back a bit. And then both of us are going to be vacating our co-chair positions because it's time for other people to lead. So it's kind of a transition. And I hope that we're able to continue the friendship that we've started and grown. I know.
No deal, Blackard.
Yeah.
No, of course, man. It's been awesome working with you all these years. It's been great shepherding this thing along. I remember in the first season, the first 3 or 4 episodes, I reported the first 3 by myself because George Shee told me to do it, if you remember, when he was the chair, by myself at RSNA. And I was just terrified the entire time. We didn't even release those 3. They were with Paul Naji, Safwan, Halaby, and Rusted was the third one. Yeah, I was terrified every single time. The whole week leading up to the episode, I'd be kind of nervous and not looking forward to it and being like, are these questions good enough? Should we remove these? Should we put these in a better order? We were using Ring or Zencaster, all these different applications that we were trying. We were editing them ourselves. I was taking out all the ums and ahs by myself through Audacity. We've come pretty far away. Now we've got a dedicated person to do all that stuff. The Zoom is working so much better than anything we've done before. We tried the Amazon application for a while. And now I just throw up the questions. You guys handle most of the legwork, or, somebody's always responsible for some part of it. And it just kind of happens. You show up and just chime in whenever you want to. It's much easier than it was back then.
Yeah, it was kind of wild. I think at one point we were trying to record using the microphones, but using the on-the-go connection to record on our tablets or phones instead of over the computer and this and that. And I remember going, I think it was one of the SIIM annual board meeting in DC and having to bring all the gear with us, pick up the gear there, and then we get handed this big box of stuff. So yeah, podcasts have definitely come a long way in the last 5 years. So it's been crazy. And like Jason said, we're now going to kindergarten, which is kind of wild.
I remember the first episode I was ever part of. We were interviewing, it was 2 of the former global ambassadors, the first global ambassadors. And I think one of their children was playing Call of Duty or something, and it was killing their connection. Yeah, and we've come a long way. I think that is one of the things that the pandemic has helped with a little bit, is reliability of online meetings. And I think that's a big part of it as well, is that there's a lot of familiarity with joining these types of sessions and recording these now. So the guests are a lot more familiar with the process.
We don't have to tell them mute yourself. We don't have to tell them it's nice if you have video. We don't have to handhold him through having a microphone. People used to just show up with their laptops and think that would be good enough, or call in with their phones. Everything's gotten a whole lot better. There are a few ideas that we floated over the years, like going to conferences. Somebody was talking about Periscope and doing live streaming and stuff. I encourage you guys to keep an open mind going in the future and try out that stuff. We still have a budget that we hardly ever use, but be creative, and I'll obviously stay on as a listener if nothing else.
Yeah, maybe when we're in person again, hopefully next year, fingers crossed, at SIIM, we'll be able to try it out. It's always weird doing it live, particularly if we're like in the vendor hall or something. There's going to be a lot of background noise and other things too. But we might be able to have a room dedicated where we can ask people to come and go and chat with us or something. But everyone is so busy at the meeting, then you can't guarantee people will actually show up. But yeah, I think that could be a good one to do, live streaming, or kind of like that pandemic live episode. We can try some stuff like that too. We kicked around a few ideas. It's sometimes hard to bring them to fruition, but yeah, anytime you have any other thoughts, Arjun, of course, we're all ears.
Awesome, guys. It's been a good season, and I'll see you all next week. And to our listeners, thank you guys for coming along on the journey, and we'll see you all next season as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome,
have a good one.
Guys. That's great.
Later, guys.
Thanks, guys. SIIMCast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at SIIM_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.